It's an honor and a pleasure to welcome you to our session on the possible use of the WTO and the international trade system as a tool to reform or discipline fossil fuel subsidies with a view to combat climate change. This session is co-hosted by ICTSD and FES. I'm FES. This session is also part of the E15 initiative by ICTSD and the World Economic Forum, where we as Friedrich Ebert Stiftung and other partners have been participating in the workstream on trade and climate policies. I'm Hubert Schillinger. I'm the director of the Geneva office of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, which is a German political foundation close to social democracy, something of a hybrid between a think tank, a provider of platforms for dialogue, and an advocacy organization with offices in more than 100 countries worldwide, including here in Argentina. Our focus is labor, sustainable development, among others. This session now is meant to complement yesterday's political declaration of a group of countries known as the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform, or the Friends as they are known in Geneva, and others who have joined them in favor of an active role of the WTO in advancing discussions on disciplining the use of fossil fuel subsidies. The session is therefore neither discussing whether there is an urgent need to rationalize and phase out fossil fuel subsidies, which according to some estimates amount to up to 6.5% of global GDP per annum. Fossil fuel subsidies divert scarce public resources away for better uses and distort markets for energy products and competition between energy sources to the detriment of clean energy. Last but not least, fossil fuel subsidies act as an important driver for climate change by encouraging over-extraction and wasteful consumption of fossil fuels, which account for 90% of CO2 emissions. By the same token, discouraging investment in clean energy, delaying the needed clean energy transition. So clearly, there is an urgent need to do something about fossil fuel subsidies. Nor are we going to discuss to great lengths whether or not the WTO would be an appropriate forum to add to the initiatives of the international community is already taking in various other forums, such as the G20, the OECD, or the Asia-Pacific Cooperation APEC, with a view to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. I think there is certainly not a consensus, but at least a groundswell of opinions which do believe that the WTO should not only complement other initiatives, but begin to play even a leading role in that regard, as demonstrated by yesterday's statement. There are quite a number of points that speak for the WTO to becoming a leading player among the international governance structures in the global efforts to reduce or even completely eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. What speaks for the WTO is, firstly, its institutional structure it provides for negotiations. Secondly, the fact that there is already a multilateral trade agreement on subsidies in general, the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures, ASCM, as part of WTO legislation. What also speaks for WTO is certainly its monitoring and its enforcement mechanism, i.e. the World Trade Policy, the WTO Trade Policy Review Mechanism, and its crown jewel, the dispute settlement mechanism, which now is disputed, itself disputed. So, well, okay, well, I hope we're going to resolve that problem, as well as fourthly, its experience with negotiating sectoral subsidies in agriculture in particular. So the discussion in our session will therefore not debate the if, but the how question. The presentations we're going to hear will mainly focus on the various technical and legal and institutional options on how the international trading system can contribute to enable countries to better address fossil fuel subsidies. By doing so, we will obviously discuss the pros and cons of the various options identified by experts as part of the E15 work and beyond. In each case, I think we will both discuss their desirability as well as their feasibility. Both will greatly depend on the rationale chosen, i.e. whether the focus will still be more traditionally on market distortions or whether the environmental impact per se should play a bigger role, the level of ambition that one is pursuing, as well as on the possibilities of tailoring the options to specific needs of member states, such as providing exemptions for subsidies aimed at the poor, or allowing for extended deadlines to put alternatives in place, among others. Now, you will hear more about this in the presentations that will follow. I now conclude my brief remarks, or not so brief remarks, by adding some personal reflection to another dimension of the debate. This is about the question of the legitimacy of the open multilateral trading system we have. In my personal belief, it is my personal belief that for the survival of the system, as it is, it will not be enough to point to the alleged benefits of further trade liberalization in terms of efficiency gains, whose contributions to economic prosperity for all, job creation, and social welfare more broadly is at best uncertain, as everybody now seems to recognize that liberalization necessarily leads to winners and losers. And as one has to keep in mind that any further progress towards venturing into domestic regulations and other forms of non-tariff barriers to trade doesn't sit very well with national sovereignty and democracy, which themselves are and remain fundamental values that advocates of trade liberalization ignore at their own peril. For the continued acceptance of the open multilateral trading system by a greater public, it's not enough to argue with business opportunities. What's more important at this juncture, in my view, is that the system we have in place can show that it can also contribute positively to achieve other non-commercial objectives as well, and align itself with the great agendas the international community has set out for itself, such as the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement. In a sense, the international trade system has to become more of a servant of other international regimes, instead of being the one that seemed to dominate all other regimes by the simple fact that its rules can be enforced, unlike most of other international rules. Therefore, by making positive contributions to sustainable development and the combat against climate change, the WTO and its members have a unique opportunity to add significantly to its legitimacy and acceptance by a critical society out there and the greater public at large. I thank you. We should not miss that opportunity.
Is this on? Yes. Thank you so much, Hubert. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ingrid Jegou. I'm from ICTSD. And so I would like to, like Hubert, welcome you all to this session, all the participants and all the speakers. And I would like to extend a special thanks to Hubert and to the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung for the wonderful partnership so far. We are only just beginning. As Hubert mentioned, this from ICTSD's perspective, the work that we have been doing on fossil fuel subsidies, it really stems out of the work under the E15 project. And the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung was our main knowledge partner in the work on clean energy subsidies, but I would also like to recognize Climate Strategies, who was our knowledge partner in the working group on climate change. And Climate Strategies is represented today by Susanne, but also Peter, who is sitting at the table, is a member. In fact, the issue of fossil fuel subsidies, it came up from several of the different working groups of the E15. So from the working group on clean energy, the one on climate change, but also the one on subsidies. So we could really feel that this is something which, for which there are good ideas to address them. So what we have done since the first expert phase of the E15 project ended is that we've been going a bit more in depth on certain issues, and fossil fuel subsidies being one of them, and I know that Climate Strategies has done the same. And what we wanted to do is to make sure that if there is a political will to address fossil fuel subsidies by the trade system, that we can show that there are also ways of doing it. There are legal and technical options. And what we saw yesterday, as Hubert also mentioned, was that there is actually political will among a growing group of countries. They made a really, I find, bold expression of that political will in their ministerial statement yesterday. And this is something that we, obviously, from ICTC side, welcome for many reasons. like the Global Subsidies Initiative estimates that a reform of fossil fuel subsidies would lead to an increase in global GDP of up to 0.7% per year up to 2050, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 18% to 2050, with neutral or positive impacts on the poorest. So, there are so many good reasons for doing this. So I think that what is important at this stage is to make sure that the work doesn't stop here. Now we have this declaration, which is a first step, and now we need to think about what can we do with it. So we have invited a wonderful panel of speakers, and we're very grateful to have all of you here. So to begin with, we have James Bacchus, who was the theme leader of the E15 report on climate change and trade. And we're very happy that he is now a senior counsel with ICTSD. James has also written many other reports on trade and climate change, including for the World Economic Forum. He was also a former member of the appellate body of the WTO and a member of the Congress of the US. We have Susanne Dröge. She's a senior fellow of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. She specialized in energy, climate, and international economics, and has a long-standing experience in working on trade and environment. We also have Robert Howse, well known for those of you who are on Twitter. He's a professor of international law from NYU, and with an impressive academic career from the University of Toronto, Harvard, University of Tel Aviv, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and the Sorbonne, and a frequent consultant and advisor to government agencies and international organizations. Jennifer Hillman, professor also of international law at Georgetown Law School in Washington. She has also been a member of the WTO appellate body and a commissioner at the US International Trade Commission, and general counsel and ambassador and chief textile negotiator at the office of the USTR. On my left side here, Michael Ewing-Chow, also a professor and the WTO chair at the National University of Singapore. So he has a degree in law from that university and a master's from Harvard, and has been involved in negotiations of some of Singapore's early FTAs. And on the other side of the panel, Matias Pinto Pimentel, a legal advisor from the Ministry of Finance of Chile. And as I mentioned to someone earlier, he's he's rare in his kind because he has both been a trade negotiator and a climate change negotiator. So when I prepared this, I realized that I'm the only non-lawyer here, unless Hubert.
I'm not a lawyer
okay.
either.
So please, Susanne,
economist.
You're not an economist. Okay, I was going to say, please be gentle with us. So I would like to give the floor now first to James Bacchus. I'm sorry, I will have to be a bit strict on time because we want to hear from all of you.
How long do you want me to talk?
Can you try in 5 minutes?
First of all, let me apologize for the hoarseness of my voice. I am usually mellifluous, smooth talking, but it's a little rough today. I'll do the best I can, if you will. I'm pleased to be here. I'm pleased to be affiliated with ICTSD. Is my mic working in the back? Can you hear me? Okay, good. And I'm especially pleased to have a chance to discuss this topic. Since I am first, let me make a point that I think needs to be made to those of you who are not constant dwellers in the footnotes of the covered agreements of the WTO treaty. This is not an issue of whether we are going to begin to discipline fossil fuel subsidies in WTO rules. This is an issue of how we will discipline fossil fuel subsidies within WTO rules. In the United States, the fossil fuels industry, the oil and natural gas people in particular, are for some reason of the mind that WTO rules don't apply to their products. There's nothing in the WTO agreement that says that. There's no exception for oil and natural gas. It's simply the case that there has not been much dispute settlement about fossil fuels products along the way. Our first case on the appellate body was, as some of you know, United States gasoline, thus making my point at the very beginning. But there is this illusion that somehow fossil fuels are not covered. What we don't have are cases in the WTO in which countries are challenging fossil fuel subsidies applied by other WTO members. We have a case that's more or less in limbo now between Russia and the European Union over energy package of the Europeans, and there's an Article 3 claim in there, but that case seems to be dragging on. So we don't have any case law. But at least, you know, on the letter of the law, it is perfectly possible now, given the facts of a particular situation, if you can meet the burden of proof, to show that a fossil fuel subsidy is indeed a subsidy covered by the SCM agreement that provides a benefit. It may be prohibited if it's conditioned on export performance or domestic content. Otherwise, it's going to be actionable, and it's going to be illegal if it has certain adverse effects. So that's the state of the law now. What we're talking about instead is what particular disciplines we might bring to bear on fossil fuel subsidies. Now, I take it as a given, and probably many of you in this room do as well, that fossil fuel subsidies are perverse. We need to be moving away from a world that is dependent on fossil fuels. It won't happen the day after tomorrow, but we need to be in the midst of that transition. And at a time when we need to be moving away from fossil fuels, we certainly don't need to be subsidizing their production and consumption. So that's where we begin. Why should the WTO be involved in this? I would say the WTO should be involved because it is the logical place, given what I just said. These are products that fall within the scope already of the WTO treaty. There is not a multilateral system of energy governance. There's no way to bring a multilateral environmental court to bear on these issues. There's no dispute settlement system in the climate change agreement. So here we are, and the question is not whether the WTO should do this, but how it should do it. The last point I would like to make, and we'll get into a lot of substance, I'm sure, in the rest of the discussion, is one about procedure. Here, the 12 friends have suggested a certain procedure that seems to me to be logical, given where we are now, and that is to work toward putting this issue on the official agenda of the WTO as a negotiating item by the time of the next ministerial. And in the meantime, to do all the preparatory work to lay out what could and should be done. And here, the good news for everyone is that the E15 has done a lot of preliminary work. There are people on this stage and in this room who have written a lot about this issue, suggesting the different kinds of ways it could be approached. We have no lack of ideas. We simply have to feed these ideas into the process that can lead to actual negotiations. Ingrid, I'm going to stop here and allow others to speak. I look forward to saying a little bit more along the way. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Jim. I'll continue probably by highlighting some of the suggestions that are worth discussing. So this is a little commercial. I did some printouts, which could be probably found over there, but you can find it online as well. So this is a product we conducted. We did produce some paper in the Climate Strategies Network. And what my colleagues mainly did, and Peter's in the room as well, they looked into 5 cases in order to put some flesh on the bone of what we just heard, right? There is a role for the WTO, but then there's this general perception, well, why does not any country, member state bring up a case compared to renewable energy production subsidies? There are some cases brought up, but not for fossil fuels, which are out there for much longer. So I don't want to dive into the reasons for that. Mostly it's about vested interests, but rather focus, because I only have 5 minutes, on what we suggested, and probably this could be subject to our discussion as well. So the legal dimension, and as I said, I'm not a lawyer, but what I learned from colleagues is that this, the problem often is with the subsidies is that you need to have specificity about what is going on, and you have to check whether or not the rules of the WTO apply. And of course, you have different types of subsidies, mostly consumer and producer subsidies, so this could make a difference for finding application or to check the application of the rules. So the closer examination of these cases, and I just name them shortly, brought us to, again, back to more general ideas, and I will mention them in a minute. Our range of cases was the US expensing of intangible drilling costs, so a producer support when drilling for fossil fuels. Indonesia's compensation for below market prices for fuels, a consumer support. Germany's manufacturer privilege, as producer support once more. Mexico's fuel tax credit for agriculture, forestry, and fisheries, consumer support. And Australia's support to Queensland's rails, coal, and freight services. So from this example, you can already learn how detailed this could become and how indirect this could also be. So it could not be a price tag that has been manipulated, but rather indirectly subsidizing production or transport or whatever relates to a fossil fuel product. So what we found, and that draws on these particular cases, is in general that, of course, there is a more, there is obviously some role for inconclusive legality for the production side subsidies, while the specificity of the consumer subsidies is tricky to relate to WTO rules, and we will hear from the lawyers more about that, I guess. We came up with some suggestions, and it's really interesting to see how far we got already yesterday when there was some initiative living up to the expectation that some countries have a high interest in pushing for it, New Zealand and Finland being amongst the leading group. And so probably this sounds a bit doubling and redundant, but it was produced before yesterday, so that's why. First of all, and this is not a ranking, it's just a collection of points, is to promote more about what do we know, so technical assistance and capacity building, what lessons can be shared on subsidy reform as such. So the WTO could be a place to exchange on that, sharing the lessons. And of course, bringing together communities that discuss this for a while. Of course, also what has been mentioned in Hubert's initial statement is that the WTO is not walking this alone. It is about connecting to the World Bank, the IMF, and Global Subsidies Initiative, and probably others. Second is the transparency issue. Notification is a popular tool under the WTO, so this should be applied here. Based on templates that could relate to the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures, or members could commit to include fossil fuel subsidies in their reviews under the trade policy review mechanism, as New Zealand did. And also they could seek to strengthen the enforceability of existing notification obligations, right? So this is low-key, but it's important as a start. Then, of course, the whole issue relates to the G20 process, and this is an option to bring more countries on board on the initiative. For instance, initiative we saw yesterday. Third point, which is probably very viable, is to pledge subsidy reform and ensure credible follow-up through reporting and review. So some members could make a pledge what they want to eliminate by when and show that this is going to happen. And this is building on the subsidy rules of the WTO. Fourth is a political declaration that's known by now. But of course, there could be declarations beyond the one we saw yesterday, right? So it's an open space, and this could happen by also relating to WTO political push for dealing with the issue. Last but not least, as a fifth point, of course, and this is a legal issue, the only one we have on our list is expand the category of prohibited subsidies under the ASCM. So that would be something that is a heavy lift, but still it could be in the longer term an option to really bring up clarity under the legal rules. I'll stop here. I look forward to the discussion. And as I said, if you have specific questions, don't hesitate to bring it up later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susanne. I think we'll run through all the interventions before we take questions. Next on my list is Rob. So the floor is yours.
Okay, so just to begin with, I would like to basically adopt or endorse everything that Jim said. I think that he has kind of set out, to my mind, exactly the lay of the land and the basic rationale for the WTO getting involved in this more explicitly. And I say explicitly because, as he said, the WTO is already involved implicitly by virtue of the existing disciplines. I'd like to talk a bit about some possible modalities and things that one wants to consider and maybe certain things one wants to avoid going forward. One thing that one wants to avoid, it seems to me, and this is based on experience of years of impasse in the environmental goods and services context at the WTO, is arguing about a definition of fossil fuel subsidies. It seems to me that members should come with lists of subsidies that provide benefits to the fossil fuel industry, and that might be subject to commitments, or, as the previous speaker suggested, I like that word, pledges. But one shouldn't spend years debating what is or is not a fossil fuel subsidy. One could take the IMF methodology, and the IMF has done a lot of work here, and it's very solid work in identifying what are fossil fuel subsidies, and use that as just a rough rule of thumb. But I don't actually think it's necessary, because of the pledge approach, members are coming forward and saying, okay, we've identified these subsidies that we consider fossil fuel subsidies, and we are making commitments to reduce them by a certain amount by a certain time, or cap the total level of support or something like that. And so if they're not including some, or if they're including others that other members wouldn't really consider a fossil fuel subsidy, I don't think there's a lot that's lost by being relatively deferential and not trying to impose some rigid criteria for what is or is not a fossil fuel subsidy, because you'll end up spending all your time negotiating what the criteria are and never really get to the commitments. It's like, somebody offers a painting to a museum, and there's a lot of uncertainty about whether it's a Tizian or a school of Tizian. which would make a lot of difference in the value. And so they spend 2 or 3 years dithering, and they never get the painting. You know, we would be better off having these commitments. It's not going to do anybody harm if somebody commits to reduce a subsidy that somebody else thinks isn't a fossil fuel subsidy. The second suggestion is to have a backup to getting this on the official WTO negotiating agenda. That is to say, the multilateral agenda, and the backup would be a coalition of the willing approach, some kind of open plurilateralism. We know from the Information Technology Agreement that as long as you operate this sort of arrangement consistent with MFN, it's entirely possible to do it in a manner that doesn't create tensions with a multilateral system or the covered agreements. And so, you know, if you have 12 countries, 15 countries, 20 countries, and they're prepared to come to the table with pledges, and you don't have MFN problems, even if you're stuck in terms of getting this into a multilateral negotiation, it's certainly possible to make significant progress. And the third thing not to do, and that relates to having a process that's kind of easy to implement, even if it can't be fully multilateralized at first, is getting into trying to change the SCM agreement. The nice thing about the pledge approach is that there's no inherent reason to alter the SCM agreement. Basically, it's an additional obligation that states are undertaking to reduce and cap particular classes of subsidies. And in fact, you might even put a clause in there that the rights and obligations of the fossil fuel agreement do not in themselves, either add to or subtract from the rights or obligations in the SCM agreement, or indeed any other covered agreement, which would, again, allow you to proceed, if necessary, on a non-fully multilateralized basis if you want to. Third, or maybe now I'm up to fourth, is run with the politics. We have to remember, going back to Smith and Ricardo, that the idea of free trade itself was that countries are doing something in their own interest that they should want to do, and that through commitments in an international framework, one is making it easier and more attractive for them to do what they should be doing and maybe doing anyhow. So, there's a positive politics about fossil fuel subsidies that's going on in a number of countries. They're, in some cases, reducing them because of fiscal austerity. In other cases, governments and important political movements are really concerned with the climate agenda. And yet other cases, they're doing it under some pressure, frankly speaking, from the IMF. And so, I think one should run with the politics in the sense of trying to say to those countries, look, you have various good reasons for doing this anyhow. This is a way of doing it that also displays your commitment to the multilateral, trading system and being a good climate citizen, and it produces an additional kind of interest that can counter the interests that might be obstructing getting rid of the subsidies. And in fact, I remember a couple decades ago, or maybe even longer, where subsidies were regarded as a huge increasing problem, and then countries went through periods of fiscal challenge. And what happened is that they found that in order to support those industries effectively, they were going to have to increase the subsidies greatly, and that wasn't politically feasible. It was kind of a breaking point. And then we saw a lot of subsidies reduced unilaterally over a certain period of time. It could well happen with fossil fuels, especially as the relative cost of renewable sources of energy continues to fall significantly, and as for various reasons that I'm already out of time can't explain here, but could explain if I had to. It's harder and harder to capitalize certain kinds of oil and gas projects. And so, if the government wants to support those projects, it's going to have to throw even more money at them. So the alternative is to actually saying, we're not going to play this game anymore. We're going to let the market work, and we're going to get rid of the subsidies. So you need to play with the ongoing politics and the transformative political economy that's happening in a range of countries on this issue. Finally, until you've got a model, a plan, a pattern, some kind of way of proceeding, don't worry so much about the critics who say it can't be done, that we don't know what a fossil fuel subsidy is, and so on and so forth. Just remember, that line from that great Bob Dylan song, don't criticize what you don't understand, get out of the way if you can't lend a hand. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I really like the last point you made. Let me just take the advantage of listening to a law professor for asking one question of clarification. What is the difference in the level of consensus that you would need from the WTO membership when it comes to reforming the SCM agreement as opposed to accepting a plurilateral approach?
Well, if you're talking about the level of consensus that would be necessary to open a negotiation like the ITA negotiation, for example, I don't actually know the precise answer to that question, but there are others in the room who are probably more qualified to give an answer to that. But the answer is that you can have such negotiations. If that's the question you're asking, then others may have a very precise legal answer to that question. I mean, we now have environmental goods and services, or environmental goods at least, negotiations going on in a complex but limited connection to the WTO framework. And when I had a chance to chat with the Director General of the WTO a year, it was just after Trump's election, actually, I asked him what was the exact legal relationship of, for example, TISA and the environmental goods processes to WTO law and, to the multilateral framework. And he gave a quite complex answer, but suggested that, at least with respect to environmental goods, it was somehow, this plurilateral negotiation was somehow, endorsed in a way by the WTO. But I don't think there's any instrument actually endorsing it at all. But somehow it's, I mean, his view was, it was proper to view it as under the umbrella of the WTO. I think at the end of the day, it's going to be very hard to prevent some group of countries of moving ahead with a plurilateral negotiation if it's entirely consistent with MFN. Because if some members object, well, we need a consensus of WTO members in order to even allow such a negotiation, then those people can say, okay, we won't call it WTO. We'll just go outside the framework. We'll meet at the Four Seasons rather than the WTO building, and we'll just do it otherwise. And if there's no MFN problem, then there's no inherent difficulty in having those negotiations. It's just that they won't have the WTO label on them. And the reason I asked Azevedo this question was that for a period of time, members were not supposed to be saying that they were negotiating environmental. This was when it shifted to plurilateral. They weren't supposed to be negotiating that in the WTO building. In fact, they were given rooms in the building to talk about it, but it wasn't really supposed to be going on, under the WTO imprimatur. Now, it seems that that problem or that kind of farce has been now solved. But all this is to say that as a legal matter, if you respect MFN and nothing you do, alters the obligations in the covered agreements, I see very little possibility of shutting down the process.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Jennifer, you're next. I don't know if you want
Okay.
to add to that
All
or
right.
just go on with your...
Perfect. Well, I may try to give you a very short answer to that question. One, it would take probably consensus, meaning 100% of the support to actually technically change the wording in the SCM agreement. There is obviously a process in the rules to go to a voting process. It's never been done. So I would assume an actual change to the SCM agreement would require a consensus. To start a plurilateral negotiation, again, outside of the auspices of the WTO requires no consensus by anybody. So the United States or any of your interested friends, actually, of fossil fuels could simply start that negotiation. The downside of doing it outside of the WTO is if you can't, at the end of the day, bring it back in, you don't have the WTO dispute settlement mechanism that would be involved in enforcing it. But basically, you could start those negotiations tomorrow. So again, that's sort of, I hope, maybe a quick way to think about it. All right, so I thought I would take up Hubert on his question of sort of how do we do this? How do we bring disciplines on fossil fuels subsidies into the WTO? And I'm going to posit 5 ideas of how to do that. I just got through the process of writing a final exam for my students in the class that I'm teaching, and I will give you the answer in advance, which is my own view is do all of the above. I mean, the correct answer is do everything. And I would sort of follow on with Rob, don't wait. Don't wait to get the perfect answer. Don't wait to get the perfect agreement. Don't wait to get the perfect definition. Try on all fronts and see which one sort of is able to move fastest and farthest. So my 5 are a new agreement, which again, I think a lot of people have discussed. To me, I would model it on the agriculture agreement, where there was clear agreement to phase out subsidies and to clearly ultimately get rid of export subsidies. There's lots of ways that the agriculture agreement can speak to how do you go about this process of cataloging and getting everybody to agree to do it. I won't dispute how difficult it will be to get an agreement, but this is where you start a plurilateral process and see where it takes you. It has a lot of advantages in the sense that it, again, it could be outside of the WTO or inside of it, and to me, a lot of these other options are really a catalyst to get us to the idea of creating leverage to create what is the best solution, which is, again, a multilateral agreement, to me, modeled on the agreement on agriculture. Why is it better? Because I think it would allow you to address the broadest possible range of subsidies. Because I do think you've got subsidies here that are consumption subsidies, you've got pre-tax production subsidies, you've got post-tax production subsidies, and you've got, in essence, the subsidy of the failure to take into account the social costs of carbon. So you've got 4 or many more categories of subsidies. If you have an agreement, you could arguably address them all. The rest of the options that I'm going to discuss probably won't let you address that broad of a range of subsidies. So option 2 is the amendment to the SCM agreement, what we've just been talking about. And there I would suggest 2 specific changes to the SCM agreement to make it very clear exactly what you're doing. One is to define a fossil fuel subsidy as prohibited. Just flat out include it in the list. I mean, we already have a list of prohibited subsidies that are considered a per se violation. You don't have to prove specificity. You don't have to prove a lot of other things. They are just on their face prohibited. Again, I would simply add it. It does have the downside, as Rob described, of at some point, if you're going down that road, of how are you going to define it? Because if you're going to say it's prohibited, you're going to have to come up with some way of defining exactly what it is that's prohibited. The second thing I would do is add to the notion of what causes an adverse effect. Because again, subsidy cases are in part disciplined by whether or not they cause adverse effects. I would include in the language within adverse effects the notion of harm to humans or to the natural environment, so that you're making it very clear that those prohibited subsidies fit very neatly within the SCM definition. So option 1, an agreement. Option 2, a change to the text of the SCM agreement. Option 3 is bring a subsidies case against fossil fuels. Again, we've had lots of challenges across the board to a number of the renewable programs, but we've had a complete reluctance of anybody to actually challenge fossil fuel subsidies. Why? I mean, part of it is to think about why, and why do I think you could bring a challenge now? The reason I think you could bring a challenge now is for the first time in a long time, the United States, among others, has become a significant net exporter. I mean, not net, I'm sorry, a significant exporter of oil and gas. Where does the United States export to? Canada, Mexico. Again, those are our largest ones. The Netherlands, Brazil, Japan. Why does that matter? Because if you want to bring a subsidies case, the point is you must have a country that is also a producer of oil or gas or whatever the product is that you're bringing. You have to have a complainant that's going to say, I'm complaining about somebody else's fossil fuel subsidies and they are harming me in some way. So if you're going to bring a case, you need to find who is your complainant. And for me, that's really the effort that this group and others ought to be thinking about. Who's a good complainant to file a case against fossil fuel subsidies, and who's the best case to be filed against? Who's got big, clear subsidies that you can go after? Again, in this case, I mean, the idea is you are going to have to prove that, yes, there is, in fact, a subsidy. I would argue that for many of the straight-up tax kind of subsidies, that's really easy to prove. And we also already have lots of subsidies on the record. I mean, many of the OECD countries and the G20 countries have actually said, yes, I confess, here are my subsidies. So for a number of countries, you already know what the subsidies are. I mean, that is not hard knowledge to get your hands around. You won't pick up all of them, but you have knowledge of what the subsidies are. So you need to, again, you need to show, yes, this country provides subsidies. Secondly, you're going to need to show that they are then, in a countervailing duty case, they are causing harm to a domestic industry that's being injured by them. And that's, I think, been the reason why many cases have not been brought. Because, quite frankly, everybody's oil industry is doing very well. So how is it that you're going to show that because the United States gave subsidies to ExxonMobil, that somehow the BP or other industries elsewhere are being injured when they're doing just fine, thank you very much, as well? So the issue is going to be, how can you find a domestic industry somewhere else? Netherlands, maybe. Production is down a little bit. Mexico, maybe there's some room in some of these other markets to show they've been injured so that you actually can bring some kind of again, it could be either an adverse effects case or a countervailing duty case. Not so much for the remedy, but for the leverage that it might create to put pressure on countries to stop doing this or, again, to come to a broader table. Option 4, to me, is to bring a subsidy case against fossil fuel subsidies brought by producers of renewable energy. I mean, this is the other ready, willing, and able, I think, complainant, is to complain, I'm trying to produce renewable energy, but I can only succeed in doing it when the price of fossil fuels is at least in the same ballpark as what it costs me to produce renewable energy. As long as natural gas and oil are dirt cheap, it is almost impossible to make renewable energy price competitive. Here you will run into the huge problem of whether or not you can show that fossil fuel energy, if you will, and renewable energy are like. And so I won't dispute that, and we could debate, and I'm happy to have that debate. We can have a great discussion about how does one define a like product and whether you can get around any of this notion that a renewable and a fossil fuel are like one another. But it's worth taking on that case. And my option number 5 is to bring a trade remedy case. Again, it could be dumping, could be countervailing duty, could be either one of them, against goods that are made with large amounts of energy inputs that come from fossil fuels. In other words, you're saying, I'm being injured because you are able to produce steel or aluminum or cement or glass where you've gotten all of your power to get your blast furnace up to 5,000 degrees or your whatever. You've used a lot of subsidized energy to produce this ton of steel, and therefore I am bringing an anti-dumping case in which you can make adjustments to the home market price to get a higher dumping duty, or you're bringing a countervailing duty case against the steel, the glass, the cement imports, challenging that embedded subsidy that came from the fact that you used a lot of fuel. So I would suggest all 5, and my view would be do them all and see which one of them. You will get benefits, different benefits and different challenges from each one of them, but all of them, the idea is to create that leverage to try to bring people to the table to get what is the best option, which is ultimately a multilateral agreement. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. And as James said earlier, there is no lack of ideas on how to do this. And now I think we just heard 5 really good ideas. And luckily we have representatives of the Friends group here, and I'm hoping that they are taking notes. So this brings us to Michael, who is the next speaker. So the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I have the advantage of having heard everybody before, and the advantage of saying I agree with everything that's been said so far. I agree with Jim that the SCM already applies, that Susanne, that there are a variety of different options beyond just the legal. Between legislation and litigation, you can have transparency, notification, monitoring, which can help. I agree with Rob that trying to define fossil fuels could be problematic, but I agree with Jennifer that what we can do is have a multiple pronged approach to solving some of these problems. A new agreement where we amend the SCM but define fossil fuels, even though that may be difficult. Creating that idea of adverse effect of harm to humans as well as adverse effect causing injury to clean energy. I think that's very inspired. And of course, to bring in other claims by green energy producers or by a CVD or anti-dumping claim. And this is important because I'm in Buenos Aires, and it's great to see old friends here. But when I looked at on the Wikipedia, it said Buenos Aires, cool breezes. That's what Buenos Aires means, nice breezes. I walked from the Fena Hotel to here just at lunchtime, and I was wondering that, where's the cool breezes? This is no bueno because no RS. And this is a problem. We are facing a real problem of climate change. Now, this is only one day, but it is early summer. Now, I'm going to speak mainly as a lawyer, and I'm going to be talking about the sort of building on what Jennifer talked about, the possibility for a dispute, and what should the interpretation of the SCM be for a dispute. A lot of WTO jurisprudence has been about trying to separate measures which attempt to protect the environment from greenwashing measures that disguise a protectionist agenda. Almost all the Article 20 cases in the WTO deal with this. So the question I would have is, should we not have a general regime that applies to all energy subsidies so that the cleanest, most efficient energy sources get to compete on a level playing field subject to an Article 20 sort of exception? The problem is that there is no Article 20 in the SCM agreement. Can the current SCM agreement, however, provide for some sort of options? And the first thing I think about is the famous Canada FIT case, which dealt with renewables, and this is what Jennifer alluded to. And in that case, the problem was that the jurisprudence trying to help the renewable market said that if a country were to choose a particular market, that market itself is one you look towards to determine whether or not there's a subsidy or benefit, especially if it's a created new market. This means that we could potentially then see different markets depending on different sorts of fuels. This is problematic. I think instead the market should really be seen as a single market for all energy, whether fossil fuels or renewables. In the same way as Jennifer alluded to, the light goods and directly competitive goods in GATT are compared. Then the dissenting panelists in Canada FIT arguing for a simple but-for test to determine whether or not there's benefit, and in the case, therefore, that follows from that, potentially injury, could work. Therefore, we would then have a way of comparing fossil fuels with green energy and all other energy sources, sort of obviating the need to define fossil fuels in that way. So I will come to a second issue that comes up from this. While we may be able to solve the issue of benefit and injury by lumping all energy sources together, there still remains a problem of specificity with regards to the definition of a subsidy. If it's not a prohibited subsidy, then we have to determine whether or not there is specificity. And this becomes part of the problem. Maybe at this stage we need to have a declaration or understanding by WTO members on this, or on a case-by-case basis, certain jurisprudential interpretations of a particular measure as being sufficiently specific. This would solve some of the problems. So you can have it agreed upon. An agreement can often require consensus. You can have an interpretation. We can go into the complexities of that. Or you can have a case-by-case interpretation. But then, by creating this, we may have a problem in that we have become over-inclusive. And for new green energy, which requires some sort of support by the state in order to get it going because of this low critical mass, or simply because a lot of the other externalities are not taken into account, we may have a problem whereby it may be difficult to subsidize green energy, and we don't want that. I think one interesting thing that has not really been looked at is looking at the Article 32.1 of the SCM agreement. Article 32.1 of the SCM agreement says, no specific action against a subsidy of another member can be taken except in accordance with the provision of the GATT 1994 as interpreted by this agreement meaning the SCM agreement. Now, normally this is interpreted to be regarding a countervailing duty specific action, and was most famously applied to the Byrd Amendment, in that the Byrd Amendment, which upon placing anti-dumping duties on foreign producers, would then distribute whatever they collected to US producers. Therefore, because they were doing that, by itself, that distribution was a subsidy and was itself a violation of the GATT as well because of discriminatory treatment. However, nothing in the SCM Article 32.1 limits it to the countervailing duty action. It uses the word specific action. I did a search of all the GATT, and it's also mentioned in the anti-dumping agreement, but the word specific action is not defined anywhere else. Could this be used to bring in GATT Article 20? Because if they say no specific action against the subsidy of another member, and this could include green energy subsidy, can be taken except in accordance with the provision of the GATT. The GATT includes Article 20. And since the GATT includes Article 20, then a discourse about Article 20 could come in to determine whether or not a subsidy action against a green energy could be an issue. After all, if we think about what US clove and US tuna did with regards to recital 6 of the TBT agreement to bring in the idea of legitimate regulatory distinction, perhaps we should also ensure that green energy subsidies could also be protected by sort of Article 20 analysis, which is good in a way for itself to discipline the green energy subsidies so that they don't become greenwashing and protectionist, but truly are about ensuring good energy subsidies that are not captured by protectionist agendas, but really help to promote better and cleaner energy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Very good point that we need to be cautious so as not to restrict the policy space for green energy subsidies. And I think Jennifer's suggestion of the modeling on the agreement on agriculture could partly be a solution to that, because you could have a green box. Let's move to the last speaker. Matias, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, the ICTSD, for your kind invitation. It's always a pleasure to be here discussing this issue on trade and sustainable development with such an important panel. Well, it's not easy to be the last speaker, because I think pretty much everything has been said, the way to move forward. So I will skip my first part, but just a note of precaution. I'm the only one who have been negotiating this kind of issue, and Chile is the only country who signed the ministerial declaration yesterday. And really, I don't envision to present on Monday this option to my minister. Okay, let's move forward on this way. We will present a dispute settlement against Canada and Mexico, and say, hey, you're crazy. It's not possible. So I will try to make something like a little bit feasible, like technically, but also politically. So I will skip straight to the second part of my presentation. Why do you think the fossil fuel subsidies persist despite all the benefits that have been presented? Well, there is the General Directorate of the Internal Policy of the European Parliament presented a paper on March this year that provide an overview of fossil fuels subsidy and gave 7 reasons why fossil fuel subsidies persisted. First was lack of information regarding subsidy. Second, opposition from interest group. Third, weak institution. And they state there was a lack of other effective means and institutional capacity to implement a more targeted policy. I was quite impressed with that statement. Fourth, lack of confidence on the government, in the meaning that there's low confidence that the government will use saving from fossil subsidy reform wisely. 5, concern over impact on the poor. 6, concern overall economic impact, over general economic impact. And last, weak macroeconomic condition. So of the 7 reasons that this paper provides for the European Parliament, there's no reason of the lack of this definition on subsidy or any other reason. So for me, like, the real question is what the WTO and the trade system can do for removing these barriers. Paraphrasing and on how we can use the WTO to discipline the fossil fuel subsidy. And in my humble opinion, the WTO can play an important role on each of these barriers, directly and indirectly. Indirectly, just taking into account the benefit of free trade that has to competitiveness, to promote economic growth, etc. And that will help to remove, like, the 3 last barriers presented on this paper. But most importantly, the first 2 barriers could be addressed directly by enhancing transparency and promoting capacity building and technical cooperation. In fact, transparency alone can have significant behavioral effect on country. For example, Chile is part of the APEC, is part of the Energy Working Group. They have a peer review on fossil fuel subsidy. Even though Chile has never been part of this fossil fuel peer review, just when they asked to delegate, oh, it's possible to have a peer review, you go straight forward to the technical advisor on energy, on finance, and say, hey, we have a fossil fuel subsidy, and they say, no, yes, they really don't know. They're starting to investigate. Just on the issue, there's probably a peer review, and definitely Chile will have to take this peer review sooner or later. So just that analysis allowed to Chile be able to sign the ministerial declaration yesterday. Otherwise, would not be possible. So transparency could be improved through, and here I agree with Jennifer, through bilateral and multilateral commitment to report fossil fuel subsidies to a common template under the agreement on subsidy and countervailing measure. Also through unilateral and plurilateral commitment to include fossil fuel subsidies within the scope of the country trade policy review, as New Zealand did. I think it's a good way to move forward. And maybe, and this is also, for me, a wishful thinking, like a cooperation between the WTO and the UNFCCC that really could help to enhance transparency. From the part of the capacity building, I think it's important because the first barrier was lack of information regarding subsidy. Is to building capacity building on technical cooperation on identify, measure, and evaluate fossil fuels. And of course, cooperation on lessons learned from countries that already been on this process. The other solution given, like reinterpretation of rule, change existing rule, in my opinion, they are really not possible. I don't envision how it is politically feasible, even though they are technically and politically correct. So as a conclusion, I can say that the trade system has technical and legal solutions to address the fossil fuel subsidy reform. But the major barrier is not technical, but political. So the trading system needs to give a political solution that only diplomacy can provide. So when the former General Director Pascal Lamy characterized the absence of fossil fuel subsidy from the WTO agenda as a missed opportunity, it meant that it was a missed opportunity from a political stand of view about the central role that the WTO and the trade system could play in the transition to a low-carbon economy, and how the international trading system can be made compatible with the UN Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Okay, thank you so much to all the speakers for excellent interventions, and thank you for sticking with time. We're actually doing quite well in terms of time, so we have about 15 minutes or so for questions. So I would like to, or comments for that matter. So I would like to collect perhaps 3 and then go back to the floor, and if we have time, we'll do a second round. And please introduce yourselves. So we'll begin here.
Thank you for excellent talks. My name is Mandy. I'm from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. I have one question and one comment. And the question relates to, because I think the fossil fuel subsidies in some aspects resemble the fishery subsidies, that not all the subsidies are harmful. There are good subsidies, there are bad, and there are, of course, ugly ones. And like the fossil fuel subsidies that go to underprivileged households, those low-income households, I think there's still a need to keep these subsidies in place for these underprivileged households. And the second one relates to the negotiation on the fossil fuel subsidies agreement. I personally prefer a plurilateral basis to get those major fossil fuel subsidy countries to join this club, a group, to get them settled on this issue and then expand the membership to get more countries to participate in. Even like multilateralism is an eventual outcome, but I think at current stage I'm more confident about the plurilateral approach. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Alejandro Jara. I'm a humble Chilean lawyer.
Right.
Let me try something from a technical point of view, but I think this is mainly political science fiction at this point in time. What about a negative list, meaning there are no subsidizations at all for any type of energy? Now, this is so then you start doing some exceptions, maybe some renewables, wind, solar, whatever. But we know that there is already impact in the market and people are responding to subsidization in this area. But subsidization for research, for cleaner energy, for phasing out fossil fuels, et cetera, et cetera. So you level the playing field in the market, but you build some exceptions in order to create certain incentives. Would that perhaps be technically better and get around the problem of definition, specificities? Because then you would, I forgot to say, you start by saying you eliminate subsidization and any other form of assistance to the production, distribution of energy. And maybe by building up what are the exceptions, you can do a better work in capturing what you want, what we all want to achieve.
Hannes Schillinger of WTO Advisors. Thank you very much. This was extremely inspiring, and I was guilty of coming late, so I may be saying something that has been said before. And then please just scold me and tell me to shut up. I always thought that the most realistic step, and I would actually add that to Jennifer's list, which I really like, but is to step up fossil fuel subsidy reporting and to systematically use the WTO mechanisms, including TPR, to push that agenda. That can be done politically, it can be done unilaterally, it can be done by a group of countries, simply by dragging things into the open, applying deliberately a slightly vague and wide definition of what subsidies actually need to be reported, because often specificity is in the eye of the beholder until the appellate body has spoken, obviously. So one could have an agenda pushing, first starting to report oneself systematically, perhaps even extending the template, and then moving forward and doing that. And the reason I'm saying that is transparency sounds like a second or third best solution, but I think Ignacio was just referring to the APEC peer review mechanism, which is perhaps too early to tell, but seems like a really successful exercise specifically when it comes to fossil fuel subsidies. Because let's not forget, the governments that subsidize fossil fuels are spending a lot of money on this, and many of them would really like to save that money and put it to better use. And if you increase transparency, I know that's the idea behind all the transparency initiatives, but I think the WTO can be a ready-made solution for good in this regard. Again, if it's been pointed out before, I'll apologize. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for that question and all the questions. In fact, it has been mentioned, but perhaps someone would like to elaborate further on it. And I would maybe, in that case, would like to add an additional question, because we already have a system for transparency and notification, but it's not being used. So how could we reach a point where Hannes's suggestion would be, a feasible way forward? How could we actually enhance compliance with the notification requirement? Jim, would you like to go first?
Let me see if I can take them each in turn. Thank you, Ingrid, and I'll be brief again. I would suggest to Mandy that she read a very fine article that's just been published by ICTSD by Heloise Pereira of Brazil, comparing the fisheries subsidies negotiations with the possibility of fossil fuel subsidies negotiations. She makes a distinction. She says that fossil fuel subsidies should be distinguished on the basis of the extent of their effect in increasing carbon emissions. And on that scale, the production subsidies are more dangerous than many of the consumption subsidies. I wouldn't go so far as to say that consumption subsidies should not be disciplined. I think they should be. The benefits of those subsidies are going not to the poorest people, but all empirical evidence shows they're going to the wealthier people. It's a bit of a scam, and it's certainly a disincentive to engage in an energy transition. But take a look at how she distinguishes that. I think you might find it worth reading. I think of all the fine articles that ICTSD publishes. This is one of the best in some time. On the second point from the humble Chilean lawyer midway down the table, Alejandro, I think your proposal should be number 6 on Jennifer's list. It makes sense in a lot of ways. On the transparency issue, I certainly strongly believe there should be absolute transparency on these issues. And I don't want to demean unnecessarily the name and shame approach. There's empirical evidence showing that it's been in many places successful, especially with a number of multilateral environmental agreements. The problem comes with name and shame when there are countries that have no shame. And right now, I have to say that my country is shameless. I don't think that that would in any way cause any change whatsoever in the U.S. Subsidization of fossil fuels. But nevertheless, it should be done, and it should certainly be on the list as well. One last point that no one asked about. I wanted to underscore a point that Jennifer made, which I think is extraordinarily important. As some of you who have nothing else to do, so read my articles, already know, I'm very strongly of the view that we need to begin seeing all of our trade and investment obligations through the prism of the objectives of sustainable development. Many of our current rules must be reimagined in ways that will make them consistent with the objectives of sustainable development, as we've promised to do in the WTO treaty. Jennifer has given us one concrete example of how that could be done in terms of adverse effects, an injury not just in the competitive jumble of the marketplace, but an injury to the environment. That should be every bit as much a reason to discipline a subsidy as an adverse effect in the marketplace. Thank you, Ingrid.
Can I add just one comment on the transparency issue? Because I think it's important. First of all, I think it has been to some significant degree said, but I do think it's important within the WTO context to do both subsidies notifications under the SCM agreement, where again the whole world has been woefully inadequate in their willingness to notify under the SCM agreement. You're supposed to notify all of your subsidies, and again that has been almost not even a significant discipline, but also the trade policy review mechanism. So I think it's important that in essence we really are clear that you're talking about both places in which these notifications should be done, and that there ought to be more effort on both fora to figure out a way to push harder for countries to discipline. And part of that, I would say, urge some of the countries that are among the friends to start doing their own notifications and their own requests of their TPRMs as a way of setting the process in motion and understanding what kinds of questions you want to ask, what kind of format you want the notifications to go in, to the extent that at least there is a group of the willing. If everybody in the willing group would agree, this is how we are notifying our subsidies, this is the questions we are going to ask of every country that's coming before us in a trade policy review, you would at least get that sort of both greater transparency and a greater consistency across the kind of data and information that you're pulling in to the trade policy review. So I, as a technical matter, I would urge it be done on both fronts.
Thank you. I do think that some of that is actually happening already thanks to the good work of some of the friends countries. Michael and then Susanne.
I'll be very short. Good questions. On Mandy's question regarding low income, always think about the alternatives. There are many ways to skin a cat. If you're really concerned about the low income people, just give money directly. Linking it to subsidies for the fossil fuels creates, as Jim says, an adverse effect. For Alejandro, I think the idea of a negative list is interesting and good. Just a bit of my experience negotiating the US-Singapore FTA when we moved for the first time into a negative list for services. The difficulty was trying to coordinate the whole country together to determine what we would put on the negative list. So that takes a lot of time. And even a small country like Singapore, where the government is fairly monolithic, it took us about 1.5 years to be confident of our negative list. I think it'll be even longer for a negative list for fossil fuel subsidies. Thank you very much.
Susanne?
Yes, I would just follow up on what the first point was by Mandy. I think I realize again how important it is to bring into this debate the fiscal dimension and the political dimension, because this argument doesn't hold. I mean, most of the subsidies do not reach those policymakers pretend they should reach. We can see that even in the agricultural policy in Europe, it reaches industrial production, but not the small farmers, right? So if you want to do something for poor people, I'm fully with Michael, you have to do some recycling of the money you save by stopping subsidies and channeling the money directly to those in need. You can look into the case of Indonesia or Saudi Arabia even, Saudi Arabia, who wants political silence in the population by subsidizing heavily local consumption, water prices next to zero. But now, with this oil price crisis, all of a sudden there was reform, and they had to burden population with higher costs. So, my major point is really that this argument comes up every time one gets serious about the subsidization. And this is a strong argument, of course, because it makes you feel very guilty. But it's, if you're talking economics, it's not about the money. You will save a lot of money you spend for subsidies, even if you recycle part of it.
Okay, thank you so much. I would have wanted to take a second round of questions, but unfortunately we're running out of time. I also have a list of questions. This is like having a living dictionary in front of us, and it's a wonderful resource. But hopefully the discussions can continue outside after this session. I would like to ask Hubert if you would like to make any final concluding remarks.
Well, there's not much to conclude. I mean, it was a very rich debate. I think it's now up to the negotiators, to the politicians. All the proposals are out there. There's also the political momentum, sort of, which gives hope. The last point would be sort of, this is now an advertisement point. It's not only fossil fuel subsidies sort of that can make trade policy supportive of climate mitigation or the Paris Agreement. There's a broader agenda, and we're going to have another event, unfortunately not in the TSDS, but over there in the Civil Society Forum tomorrow, where we're going to discuss with some of our speakers here, Susanne and James, and two other speakers, so the broader agenda of how to make trade policy supportive of the Paris Agreement. It's 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. Who has time and the energy, whatever, nothing better to do. The program is here. So you gave me that opportunity, and I think that I'm thanking.
Thank you so much, Hubert, and thank you to the wonderful panel, and thank you to all the participants for your good questions and your attention.